CAIR's office in Maryland is providing the CAIR podcast as a public platform for discussion, ideas, and information. The views expressed in each episode do not necessarily reflect the views of CAIR or any of its affiliates. References to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by CAIR. Hello and welcome to the CAIR podcast. Today I have with me Delegate Gabriel Acevero. Gabriel Acevero is a Trinidadian American union organizer, political activist, and politician. Representing Maryland's 39th House District. Gabriel Acevero is one of the youngest people ever elected into the Maryland House of Delegates. He is introducing a bill titled Anton's Law, a bill requiring transparency in the investigations of complaints against police officers. Anton's Law is named after a young African American, Anton Black, who was murdered by police in Greensboro, Maryland. Delegate Acevero, how are you today?
Doing well. Just really good to be in conversation with you, Yusuf. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Thank you so much for asking. We're also joined today.
It's so good to be the first person on the podcast.
Yes, sir. I felt like we should just start with a bang. And with you, I know I met you a couple weeks back, and I'm actually still astonished by your presence. Thank you so much. What you're doing is a great work, and we're so grateful to have somebody like you to fight the good fight for us. We're also, yes sir, we're also joined by Yasmin El Kushri from CAIR. How are you today, Yasmin?
I'm good. I'm glad that I'm going to be engaged in this conversation. I feel like it's going to be a great conversation to have in this day and age, and thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Can you just tell us a little bit more about your role within CAIR, please?
Yeah, sure. I'm the public engagement and media intern at CAIR, so what I do is I reach out to news outlets and whatnot. I write press releases, so I'm kind of engaged with the whole putting CAIR out there and writing things for them. So that's the main thing I do for CAIR, and then I also help others on the side, other interns on the side with their projects as well.
That's great work. So, Delegate Acevero, I want to start with Anton's Law. As we introduced in the beginning, Anton's Law is a law requiring police transparency. Can you tell me more about Anton's Law? What the message behind the law is, what is being changed, and what are we expecting out of Anton's Law for the public?
Yeah, sure. So Anton's Law is named after Anton Black, a 19-year-old college athlete who was killed in police custody on the Eastern Shore. And it's a law that, in essence, gets to the heart of the issue surrounding his death, which was transparency, particularly when the family and the community were calling for answers and an investigation, and were provided with no information at all until a number of people got involved, to include Governor Hogan. Mm-hmm. And it addresses a number of things, but we named it after Anton Black because this was a young man who not only had so much potential, but it's very easy for us to forget those within our own state or in our own neighborhoods who are victims or have died as a result of police violence. And oftentimes their names aren't memorialized. Their debts aren't being raised by the people in power, and you're not seeing the kind of a public policy responses that our communities have been calling for. And when I met with Anton Black's family, I wanted to not only continue working on an issue that I've been working on for a really long time as a Black Lives Matter activist before running for office, but I wanted to honor a young man who should have been alive today, who had so much promise and had so much to look forward to, not only as aspiring, college athlete, and someone who actually wanted to work in law enforcement, but he was also an expectant father. And so there was so many things for him to look forward to, and he should have been alive today, but he's not. And part of that is because of the structures that are currently in place that allows for someone like the former officer that killed Anton. Well, I should really say there's a lot of officers that were involved in his death. It was not just one. But the systems that allow for something like this to happen and for there to be no transparency, for there to be no accountability and no justice. And that is the system that we're trying to shake and dismantle. But more importantly, we wanted to memorialize a young man that should have been alive today, who is yet another victim of police violence, not just in this state, but in this country. And I also wanted to let the family and the community know that they were not just seen and their calls were not just falling on deaf ears, but we were listening and we were responding in a way, public policy-wise, to ensure that there are no more Anton Blacks, right? There are no more Freddie Grays, there are no more Corin Gaines and Robert White and Fanan Berhe and so many others, right? And that's what we wanted to do, address the issue of police transparency and accountability through public policy while memorializing a young man who should have been here today and honoring the community and their calls by saying that we're going to fight for Anton's law.
I wholeheartedly agree with that, and I think the entire nation should at least know Anton's name and not have to worry about another story like Anton's. I feel like we need to enrich that in our society as a whole. I want you to talk with us about what is Anton's law tackling as certain points. What is being changed within law enforcement? We're talking.
And it's a really, really important question because Anton's law does a number of things.
Yes, you're right.
One is it addresses the Maryland Public Information Act, the MPIA, which in essence would allow for the kind of a transparency that communities have been calling for. And the Maryland Public Information Act is in essence like a state form of FOIA, Freedom of Information Act. And there are certain reforms that need to be made to the MPIA that would allow for the kind of a transparency that we're talking about here, right? And Anton's law addresses a piece of the MPIA, particularly around police misconduct records. And it, in essence, would do what the New York State Assembly recently did a couple of months ago, which was make police misconduct records public, because one of the things that we know from the officer that killed George Floyd and what we know about Webster, who was one of the officers involved in Anton Black's death, is that they had multiple use of force reports on their record. But in addition to that, you see in the case of Webster here in Maryland, the police chief of Greensboro, where he was hired, attempted to cover up these multiple use of force reports and faced a misconduct in office indictment from the Maryland State Prosecutor's Office, which he pled guilty to. And it just shows not only the inadequacies in state laws, but the ways in which it allows for someone like Webster and someone like a Derek Chauvin and someone like the officer that killed Mike Brown, so many others, to not only get away with impunity, but to be hired elsewhere to continue working within law enforcement.
Right.
And those are the things that we need to change. And so Anton's law would not only address the Maryland Public Information Act, it would also address the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, the LEOBR,
Right.
which in essence is a law that provides procedural protections, not rights. These are protections or privileges that law enforcement officers have that you and I as ordinary citizens, you, Yasmin, and myself, do not have. And it provides these special privileges that makes it hard for the discipline, the rooting out, and the holding accountable of corrupt and racist cops.
Right.
And so Anton's law, in essence, would repeal a provision of the LEOBR that says only a sworn officer can investigate and interrogate another sworn officer. And what that would do, in essence, would empower civilian review boards to then have greater oversight and greater power in terms of how investigations of alleged misconduct take place. And lastly, what Anton's law would do is it would establish a statewide use of force standards. And one of the things that we know is that Black, Brown, LGBTQ+, Indigenous people, people with disabilities, they are disproportionately, forces disproportionately used against these groups, Black and Brown people. And with a lack of use of force standards in our state as well as in our country, what we are allowing for is the abuse and the use of excessive or deadly force when it is not justified,
Right.
and no kind of accountability for an officer or officers who use excessive force when it is not necessary or it is not appropriate. And what kind of accountability mechanisms do we have in place to ensure that we're holding them accountable? And so Anton's law would not only establish statewide use of force standards, but ensure that there are criminal implications for officers who used excessive or deadly force when it is not justified. And so it does a good bit of things, and that's why I said it's a really important question about what is that Anton's law does.
Right.
But when we talk about ending police violence, what that means is focusing our efforts at the federal, at the state, and at the local level, but particularly at the state level, because state legislatures are in the driver's seat.
Right. That's very important.
Of police transparency and accountability, right? So our efforts should be focused on state capitals. We saw the New York State Assembly repealed a law making police misconduct records public. We see other state legislatures in California passing use of force standards, as well as stronger transparency measures. We see other states taking up various legislation from Illinois to states in the South. And what's important is that state legislatures are leading on the issue, but we're making calls upon our federal as well as our local elected officials, because ending police violence requires action at the federal, state, and local level, but especially at the state level and in state capitals across this country.
Very well said. Thank you so much. Now, with Anton's law, that was the first portion, I believe, was introduced in March 2019. Is that correct?
Yes. So I introduced Anton's law my first session, and I introduced it during this year's session. So it was introduced for the second time, and it's a piece of legislation that we're working on with the Coalition for Justice for Anton Black. We're working with the family, and we're working with a number of other advocacy groups in ensuring that we're pushing for the kind of reforms and the kind of standards that Anton's law is calling for.
So what do you personally feel that needs to happen differently this time around so we can get this law passed?
So I think we as impacted communities, but also people who stand in solidarity with our struggle,
right,
we have to keep the momentum on the issue, recognizing that once the sensationalism around Black death has dissipated, once the social media clout leaders or wannabe clout leaders have stopped posting or showing up in the streets, once those who appear to be concerned and speak out and say Black Lives Matter, but then aren't willing to do the other actions that we are calling for in terms of holding your elected officials accountable, showing up in these spaces of power and agitating, disrupting, advocating, doing what is necessary to ensure that the kind of a public policy that our communities are calling for is what is getting passed and not some watered down, mediocre, cosmetic legislation to say, well, look, we got this victory, but it doesn't really address the issue, right? So we have to ensure that we're showing up, right? All of this, because we've seen this before, right? We've seen the entire country become motivated to take to the streets, and in the middle of a global pandemic at that, to not only say Black Lives Matter, but to protest, to occupy, and to call on people in power to do something. And then we see how that sort of dissipates over time. And as an organizer, one of the things that we know is that this has to be sustained, right? The advocacy, the organizing, the educating, the mobilizing, that has to be a sustained effort. And so what that requires is people who are standing in solidarity with us, that they continue to do so, and especially when we need them the most, and that is when, the state legislatures convene, when we come back to our sessions, that we're getting behind the legislators who have been pushing this issue for a really long time and have been making the personal, the professional, and the political sacrifices to advance the issue and to ensure that we get there. I've said, and I've also, and this is really, really important when we talk about the broader fight to end all forms of violence, really is we need not allies in this fight. I know a lot of people talk about allyship and allies, and to me, allyship suggests you are rightfully aware and upset, but you are also passively spectating the kind of oppression that some groups experience, right? And that to me is what allyship suggests. What I need and what oppressed people need, whether it's women, whether it's Muslims, whether it's LGBTQ plus people with disabilities, Black, Indigenous people, what we and these groups need are not allies, but co-conspirators in the fight, right? People who are willing to not just organize and show up, but also make the same necessary sacrifices that these groups have been making for a very long time to assert their humanity. That's what it means, right? When Dr. King talks about our struggles are inextricably linked, that is what he is talking about, right? I am not free if you or any of us aren't free, right? Because if they are attacking your rights and denying your humanity, right? The same systems and the same power structure and the same people in power will do the same to other oppressed minority groups within this country because they have been given the green light, so to speak, because they've done it with other groups. And what we have to be are co-conspirators in each other's liberation, right? Yes, I'm Black, but I also understand that I need to stand in solidarity and be a co-conspirator with my Muslim family, because the same system that denies Muslims in this country, not just in this country, but across the world, right? Islamophobia is global,
Right.
right? And the same systems that deny Muslims their humanity are the same systems that have and continue to deny other groups of their humanity. And so the moment we understand that connection and why it's important for us to fight for each other, right? That is when we will truly get to the point where we're all actually free, right? One of the things I love to say is let's get free, right? Let's make that a hashtag, right? Let's get free. And that's what we're all fighting for, right? For self-determination, for freedom, and for us to assert our humanity. And we can only do that by standing in solidarity and choosing to be co-conspirators and not allies, right? And we can have a discussion about, that word and what it means to various people. But to me, what I think we should all be is co-conspirators in each other's struggles to ensure that we all get free.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that you're touching on, because a lot of people nowadays are more performative than they actually are, would take action for things that they believe in. So it's more like, oh, let me post this on my Instagram story.
Performative wokeness.
Right.
Exactly.
It's a willingness to say Black Lives Matter. It's a willingness to show up, right? But when it's time to support the policies that would make that statement true, when it is time to show up and to agitate and to occupy and to at times put yourselves and your bodies on the line, right? Where are we, right? Because whether we look at every single movement, whether it's the suffragette movement, whether it's the civil rights movement, whether it's the LGBTQ movement, whether it's the labor movement, these have been struggles that have required people not only showing up, not only agitating and advocating and educating, but at times making certain sacrifices that includes putting yourself on the line. Right? And so we have to understand that and we have to be willing to show up because there are people that are benefiting from this current structure. Right. And the only way we are going to dismantle the system that we are saying denies the humanity of so many people is by a willingness to, and the moment or the issue may not always require it, but I think when it comes to the issue of police violence, we have to be willing to show up. The quicker we understand that, it only makes our movement stronger.
So as we're saying, we all just need to put our hands together and get to work. And as you would say, we can all get free together. Instead of being allies to one another, we can be co-conspirators to one another and help each other. Because at the end of the day, we are still fighting the same fight.
Absolutely.
It's a different battle.
Yeah.
We're all fighting different battles, but we're all fighting the same exact war against a very unjust system.
Yes, same oppressive system, and there's intersectionality to these issues, right? And we have to recognize that too. One of my favorite quotes from Audre Lorde is, who said that there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. So you, Seth, don't just fight for the rights of the Muslim community as a Muslim, but also fighting for issues that impact the Black community as a Black man, but also fighting on other issues that are intersectional, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's immigrant justice, etc. And the same thing with Yasmin, not only fighting for the rights of Muslims, but also for the rights of women, right? Because we all exist at the intersection of these various identities and these various groups that we belong to,
Mm-hmm.
that at one time or another can and have been oppressed and continue to be oppressed
Mm-hmm.
of this current power structure and this current white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal, cis, hetero, classist, ableist, Islamophobic, right? Homophobic, transphobic. You know, this is the world that we live in, right? And so we have to be willing to fight for each other, because that's how we all get free, and understanding those intersectional fights,
Mm-hmm.
right? By fighting for those intersectional issues, we are freeing our own selves,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think that's what we should be, that should be the larger commitment.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And as we all continue to fight the same fight, I feel like one way we can all co-conspire together is to vote. And I want you to tell me how are we voting in November as a state? Because I see that question a lot, and I am myself as well, as I'm voting in November. How should I expect myself to vote in Maryland in order to bring these changes?
Yeah, I think we should all vote our values. We should vote our interests,
Mm-hmm.
and we should vote to make our communities and this country what Dr. King called a beloved community,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think that's how we should always approach candidates and elections.
Mm-hmm.
Do they match up to the values that we talk about as Muslims, as Black and brown people,
Mm-hmm.
as, you know, people who believe in equity, inclusiveness, justice, right? Do these candidates match up in terms of our interests, right? Do we believe that if this individual or individuals are in this position of power, that it would serve the interest of my community and this country?
Mm-hmm.
And then we must also think about, again, what Dr. King called a beloved community, where we're building an inclusive, equitable, caring, and democratic society
Mm-hmm.
that takes care of especially the most marginalized amongst us,
Right.
right? And I think when we think about that and we go into the voting booth, that is how we should be voting. And I think if anyone looks at that criteria, they would know that the people we should not be voting for
Mm-hmm.
is the current occupant of the Oval Office,
Right.
and his veep. I think we also know that we shouldn't be voting for certain candidates
Mm-hmm.
at the congressional and, depending on what state you live in, at the local level,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so we should obviously be using the instrument that voting and elections are, because it really is an instrument in this whole democratic project,
Mm-hmm.
because democracy comes from the Greek word demos, meaning the people.
Mm-hmm.
And so we are the ones who, in essence, determine through democratic processes how our communities and our society should be run, right?
Mhm.
And what kind of a society we'd like to be. And a
And I
part of
think
that is voting and elections.
I think you wrote something a while back, and you said if communities don't have oversight and control over how public safety is administered in their communities, then we're not reimagining public safety, we're maintaining an oppressive systems. And I feel that goes perfectly with what you just said. I feel us as communities really do need to do that.
I mean, that's ultimately what it is. And, and the reason why I wrote that is because you're hearing from a lot of elected officials, from a lot of people in power across this country, the phrase of reimagining public safety. And they're doing that in response to the activists in the streets, the organizers in the streets, and the calls that are being made by various movements and organizations. And we have to hold them account. One, we have to define what it means to reimagine public safety from our perspective, right? We cannot allow anyone's definition of reimagining public safety to be thrust on us. We have to define what reimagining public safety is, and I think our communities have been doing that for a very long time, right? And the reason why I wrote that is because I think it's important to remember, because a lot of people have used that term, and where are we months later in terms of those changes, systemic changes and policy changes that would really reimagine public safety. And so I wrote that so that people can understand that at the end of the day, if communities do not have oversight and control over how public safety is administered, right? Because that's at the heart of reimagining public safety, right? How can the communities, right, have oversight and control over how public safety is administered in their communities, right? And if we are not addressing that fundamental piece, then we are really not reimagining public safety. We are maintaining the very oppressive systems that we recognize as a problem and has come out, or its inception has come out of slave patrols, right? That's the inception of law enforcement in the United States. And if we aren't willing to make those structural changes and dismantling those oppressive systems, then we're not reimagining public safety. We're just maintaining those oppressive systems, and we're trying to give, because we're not going to be fooled at the end of the day, but we're trying to give the impacted communities, the activists and the organizers in the streets, this false comfort that we have somehow responded to your concerns.
And I feel as if oversight and control is the umbrella of not only public safety, but as well as education, as well as healthcare. And public safety is one of these pillars that these communities need to have oversight for, and control over. And for example, we have like all these different issues going on right now amidst this entire global pandemic, where we need these local communities to band together and have as much oversight and as much control as they can in order to steer their own communities. Instead of steering the entire nation, they need to steer their own communities into the right path.
Absolutely. And it also, that oversight and that control also trickles over to the budget and budgetary decisions as well. So what that means is the amount of money that is being allocated at the federal, the state, and at the local level to law enforcement. Where is the oversight? Where is really the control on how and how much is spent on law enforcement, and how much is spent on policing in these communities? And that's why you're hearing, as part of the calls of activists and organizers and groups to defund the police. When we say defund the police, what we're setting up in essence is a budgetary conversation. We're talking about budgets here. And I say fund something, and when I say defund something, I I'm engaging in a budgetary conversation.
You're allocating funds. You're not taking
Correct.
away. Right.
Correct. And if we're having a budgetary conversation, then let's look at the budgets. As a country, the United States spends around $115 billion annually on law enforcement, more than any other country allocates for its military, save for China.
Wow.
Right? At the state level, Maryland spends a little over $2 billion on law enforcement and the correctional system. At the local level, my county, Montgomery County, we spend around $300 or so million on our police departments, right? And this is not to include the sheriff's department.
Wow.
Right? And we see in Baltimore City where the budget is around a third of Baltimore City's budget, right? When we say defund the police, what we are saying is the money that we are spending is not only excessive, but we are ignoring the other investments, the critical investments that we need to make in communities and in certain areas that would ensure that our communities are safer. Right? More police don't make my communities safer, right? More police in certain communities does not make people feel safer.
Does not.
Right? And when we look at black communities in this country are the most over-policed communities in America. And when we talk about things like greater police presence, when we talk about things like more funding, what we are doing is perpetuating over-policing, which leads to over-criminalization, which leads to the kind of over-incarcerations that we've seen, because law enforcement is the first point of contact for the justice system, or as I call it, the criminal legal system, right? Because we don't have a justice system in the United States.
No, sir.
There isn't there is no semblance of justice. What we have is a criminal legal system, and the first point of contact for that criminal legal system is law enforcement. And so when we say defund the police, what we're calling for is the reallocation of funds, whether it's to education, to healthcare, to housing, to workforce development, to jobs programs, to even, I would say, building out a direct cash assistance or guaranteed or universal basic income program in that jurisdiction, so that we're really helping people and we're giving them agency to thrive and to better their communities and to contribute. Those are the things that really make us safe.
I feel as if these numbers that you just put out for us, by defunding the police, we could easily obtain all these points that you just talked about, as a universal basic income, as healthcare for all. We could even.
I think we could get quite a bit of that. I think there are a lot of other things that we need to do as a state and as a country in order to get a lot of what I've been talking about, whether it's Medicare for all. I've introduced at the state level the Healthy Maryland Act, which in essence would bring about a single payer Medicare for all system in the state of Maryland. Maryland is the only state that, if we wanted to, tomorrow or the next day, to establish a single payer Medicare for all system in the state, we can do that. Unlike other states in the country, for a number of reasons, one of which being we already have an all-payer system, and we already control and regulate certain prices and services, etc. So we have a strong foundation that if we were to move towards a Medicare for all system, we would have the ability to do so. And a lot of other states and jurisdictions cannot say that, right? And when we talk about things like Medicare for All, when we talk about things like universal basic income, which is another piece of legislation that I've introduced my first and second session, when we talk about things like funding our schools and funding our states for historically Black colleges and universities, ensuring that we're creating and building out and investing in a social housing program.
Right.
All of these things require funds, but oftentimes some people in power would like you to believe that we do not have the funds or the resources are not there in order to fund these priorities. So in addition to defunding the police, what we need to be doing is looking at our state's tax code. Because as of right now, Maryland has an archaic tax code that in essence puts more of a burden on working people rather than the wealthy and corporations, the people who can and should be paying more but aren't. And so there's a number of things that we need to do in order to fund these priorities, but we should never accept from elected officials that we do not have the funds are not there and the resources are not there and the capabilities to get those resources are not there. What is not there is the political will to do that. And so that's part of the conversation too, is pushing people in power to ensure that they're making those changes as it relates to our tax code at the state and the federal level to ensure that it is fair and that we can be funding some of these priorities like a social housing program, like Medicare for All, like free public transit, like a universal basic income program, right? Like a youth jobs program, and investing in these historically neglected communities.
And as I feel like as a more recent or a more trending topic right now, we see the USPS fighting amidst the same fight. With these problems is trying to be dismantled from within. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm sorry. Say that again, Yusuf.
I said as the same thing goes on right now with the USPS, with it being dismantled and defunded within by our federal government. How it's being trashed, and we've seen literal mailbox missing from Baltimore City these past weeks. We're seeing sorting machines being trashed. Why is that happening, and why is it happening now?
But I think what we're seeing is a direct assault on our democracy. That's what we're seeing with the intentional defunding and attempts at crippling the United States Postal Service. What people don't realize is, in addition to the important role that the USPS plays in our democracy in terms of mail-in ballots and absentee ballots, which are pretty much treated the same in states, what we're also forgetting in this conversation is that the elderly, our seniors, veterans, and a lot of other people count on the United States Postal Service for a number of other things, such as medication. And what we are doing is not just attempting to cripple our democracy and this general elections in the fall, but we're also jeopardizing the health. And I think there's a certain insidiousness to all of it that is showing just how far the occupant of the Oval Office is willing to go, but also the complicity of Republicans in all of this.
And we see now the most trending topic I'm looking at. We're seeing that Nancy Pelosi is calling back the House for a vote to protect the USPS, while Mitch McConnell is on vacation, refusing.
Absolutely. And again, it's the complicity, right? That there are people in positions of power in the Congress, as well as in the White House, and in other parts of the country who are complicit in fascism, because that is exactly what is taking place right now and what is coming out of this White House. It is fascism. And there are a lot of people who are complicit in this kind of a behavior, this kind of a toxicity, this kind of xenophobia, Islamophobia, classism, ableism, racism, all of this that is this vitriol that is coming out of this White House that so many Republicans across this country are complicit in. And so we have to be not just vigilant, but we also need to ensure that we're voting, and we're voting early. And whether it's mailing it in, whether it's dropping your mail, dropping your ballot drop box that the State Board of Elections and local Board of Elections have, been putting out across the state, or whether you feel comfortable going into the limited polling locations, we need to ensure that we're making our voices heard through the ballot box, and we're voting, and we're doing our part to ensure that we're not just getting the current occupant and flipping this Congress, but then we're holding the very people that we then elected, because oftentimes we think, well, civic engagement ends at the ballot box, right? No, right? Democracy is not a spectator sport, right? Going back to what I said earlier, demos, meaning the people, right? So we have to be constantly engaged, not just to elect those who match our values, our interests, and the kind of community and country that we'd like to see, but also we're holding them accountable after we put them in these positions of power, right? And we're ensuring that they are delivering on the commitments that they have made as candidates when they needed our vote.
That is very well said.
Includes LGBTQ plus people. And so I don't for a second I don't take for granted any of my other identities as someone who identifies as Afro-Latino, someone who is an immigrant, someone who is, formerly working poor. And these are all experiences and identities that inform not just my advocacy, but the work that I do and how I do that advocacy. And it's important for those lived experiences to be at the public policy table. All of those experiences, whether it's the experience of Yasmin as a Muslim woman in this world, that has to be represented at the public policy table, or you, Yusuf, as a Black Muslim in the world, right? That needs to be represented. Indigenous people, people with disabilities, right? Working poor people, all of these experiences should be represented at the public policy table, because that's how we make sound public policy, right? When we're doing it and we're cognizant of the fact that we're making public policy for a diverse, plural society.
Representation is the most important thing, but I feel like as a young African American, as a young Black Muslim in America, there are numerous times where I find myself very underrepresented, especially in my community, in my state, in my county. I look around and I'm just like, there's a lot of people that look like me. I share experiences with a lot of people, but when it comes to people who protect my rights, when it comes to people who protect my neighborhoods, a lot of these people don't look like me. So I find that I myself, I'd like to be represented by law enforcement officers in our police departments. I feel the need to be represented by lawmakers in our General Assembly. I feel the need that I need to be represented by my people in Congress.
Right.
Because in doing so, that gives me not more of an opportunity to succeed, but it gives me more than a whole new opportunity that I feel safe, I feel represented, I feel like my vote matters, and I feel like my issues are being heard at the very least. And it's much more like I feel suppressed to a point that I can't really talk about certain things because it's no way that they're going to be changed, because the people in charge of changing these things are kind of just like putting our issues to the side, and they're working on their special agendas with their special interest groups.
Yeah, I think it also comes full circle to the fact that we all have to band together to make sure that these changes are actually made, because if it's one person trying to fight for himself, or it's one group trying to fight for themselves, it's not as impactful as everybody banding together and making sure that the policies they want are put in place, and they make sure that the representation is there. So again, I think it just comes back to the fact that we all need to band together and not have performative people who just want to post something on their social media, for instance, and they have no actions behind their words. I think the most important thing is that we make sure that we're putting our foot forward and taking actions with our people, so that we have a voice in like the important areas. So that we have a voice and we're able to make the changes that we want.
I agree, and I think equally as important to the conversation too, as important as representation is, what kind of a representation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then
Right.
Going back to what I said earlier about, at the end of the day, what we as oppressed communities and oppressed people should be striving towards is liberation.
Right.
That's the goal.
The ultimate.
Liberation.
Mm-hmm.
And liberation, what that means is not just self-determination,
Mm-hmm.
right? It not only means freedom,
Mm-hmm.
right? But it means agency,
Mm-hmm.
right? And as we're fighting for that end goal, which is liberation, understanding also that representation does not equal liberation,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because, and I'll say that again, representation does not equal liberation. And what I mean by that is you can have a particular group represented in power,
Mm-hmm.
right? But the policies that the community have been calling for that would get us to the point of liberation, you can see none of those policies being enacted.
Right.
Right?
And on the other hand, we can also have these people that don't look like us, represent us, and still put forward these policies that still lead us to liberation. And these are the people that you were speaking of earlier as being co-conspirators, or as being people who are along the front lines of us, bringing upon this change, bringing about this freedom.
Absolutely, and they can do that. But also understanding too that the solutions to the problems, and I talk about this. I wrote a recent piece called "When Pain is the Prerequisite for Progress,"
Mm-hmm.
and in that piece, one of the things that I talk about is it's important for us to work with and listen to the impacted communities.
Right.
Because those closest to the pain are closest to the solution,
Mm-hmm.
but aren't always closest to power.
Right.
And what that means is, and that ties into the representation piece of it, because obviously we want to see that representation of our communities in power,
Mm-hmm.
right? But we also want to ensure that we're getting that good representation, people who not only understand, but are accountable to our communities and establish what I call, these co-governing models, meaning if you are an elected official in power, what kind of a co-governing model are you working from?
Mm-hmm.
Ensure that you're working with the community on some of the concerns that they shared with you as a candidate and as an elected official, right? How are you working with the community to ensure that the solutions that they provided and have identified are being enacted, right? And that's a big part of it. It's, yes, we want representation, but we want to ensure that we're getting good people from our communities in office who are willing to not just fight for us, but willing to challenge the status quo, willing to be held accountable to what it is that they say and what they've said, right? That's what we want. We want representation, but we want good representation and folks who are in tune with our community.
Right.
And how y'all feel about the census? Have y'all filled out your censuses yet?
I have not yet.
Okay.
So
all right.
I've recently moved to.
What's the word?
My dad filled it out online, I think a week ago, maybe.
Okay. Did you fill out yours, or did he just?
I haven't filled out mine personally, but I think, isn't it for like the whole family though, like the online one?
Oh, yeah. Well, I guess he can. Your dad can indicate how many folks are in the household.
Mm-hmm.
So that's being counted. But we want to make sure, especially you, Yusuf,
right,
that we are completing the census.
Right.
A number of folks may not know how important the census is, and part of completing the census and part of our responsibility as people is to ensure that we're educating our community on the importance of filling out the census. And for folks who aren't familiar and listening to the podcast, the census is constitutionally mandated, and it is done every 10 years,
right,
where we in essence count everyone living in the United States, regardless of race, gender, identity, gender expression, religion, zip code, socioeconomic, whether you are documented or undocumented. Everyone that lives in this country must be counted so that we have an accurate understanding of how many people not only living in this country, but then where the resources and the federal funds and the state and the local funds should be going, because part of the census is not just counting everyone that is in this country, but also it's about federal funds, it's about dollars.
Right.
And when communities don't complete the census, what we are in essence losing is money to our communities. And so it's critical that all of us participate in the census, because not only is it about federal funds and dollars, but it's also about political power.
Right.
Because after we do the census, state legislatures, the Maryland General Assembly, is charged with then now drawing congressional, state legislative, and councilmanic districts, right, where we live, and that determines who represents us. It determines how much political power we have. And so if we don't participate in the census, what that also means is that we are not exercising our political power as communities to ensure that we are counted, that we're seen, and that our communities are represented and districts are drawn in a way that allows us to not only see the representation that we'd like to see, right, but also have the kind of political power that other communities have in this country. So it's really, really important for many reasons, but those two being the biggest, of course, it's where the resources and the dollars go, which is critical. We do not want our communities losing funds, but also it's about political power, right? Because as oppressed people, right, one of the things that we should be, a number of things that we should be doing is organizing our people, organizing our resources and funds, and then organizing power. We have to organize our communities first, right? Ensure that our people are educated and engaged. We have to organize resources within our communities, financially, whether it's to support candidates or to support initiatives that are beneficial to our community, and then organizing power, meaning not only getting our own elected or good people elected to these positions of power, but then holding those individuals accountable and creating those co-governing models. So we got to be engaged, we got to be active, and we got to fill it out. So if you're listening to this podcast, great, because it's a great podcast and you should listen to all future episodes of the podcast. But let's make sure that we are filling out the census, that we are requesting our ballots, that we are filling out our ballots, that we're talking with our family, our friends, our neighbors, and we're ensuring that they are filling out the census as well as their ballots. And we're not just showing up and ensuring that we're being counted, but we're ensuring that our voices and our concerns and our communities are heard at the ballot box in November.
And hopefully we get to that ballot box in November. If it's not.
Well, it is global pandemic going.
Yes. And looking at it now, voting by mail as well might be an issue. But we are just waiting to hear more information.
Well, that's what the occupant of the Oval Office and Republicans in the GOP want. They want to cripple our democracy. And so we have to not only be vigilant, but we have to, especially now more than ever, be participating and ensuring that whether we're visiting one of the limited polling locations, whether we are driving up or dropping off our ballots at one of the ballot drop boxes across the state, or whether we are mailing or putting in an absentee ballot or mailing ballot, which in essence is treated the same, we have to ensure that we're doing our part and we're showing up. That's critical. A lot of the issues in the middle of a global pandemic with this level of Islamophobia and the toxicity and all kinds of oppression that's coming out of this Congress and this White House, we have to dramatically change things and do so through our vote, because it's really, as my former frat, as my frat brother and former Congressman John Lewis, put it. I mean, it's one of the most powerful tools to bring about change. Right? It's not there are other things that we can do, but it's certainly one of the most powerful tools, and we have to ensure that we're exercising it.
And going into that, I feel Acevero's reading your bio was very enlightening, by the way. You are a member of the Phi Beta Sigma fraternity as well.
Yes, brother. Absolutely.
As the former congressman. But reading into it, I'm seeing here you started college at 16, earning your associate's degree in international relations from Montgomery College, and then later on a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Baltimore County, or University of Maryland, Baltimore County, UMBC.
All right, shout out to UMBC. Get it? Don't.
Go Dogs.
Up on that one, Yusuf. Come on now. Come on now, Yusuf.
At the age of 20, that is very impressive. And you were a student activist in college as you volunteered for political campaigns, and you were active in the state Democratic Party. What is your message for these young adults going into school now? And the question I always get is, like, a lot of students are starting this new educational experiment in their academic careers remotely or virtually. So that takes away from me an example. Like, I don't have these activities, I don't have these clubs, I don't have these organizations to join if I was on campus, right? So now that we're learning remotely, we're going online amidst this pandemic, what's your message to these young aspiring activists that want to do something, that want to bring upon change, that want to make their voices heard remotely? What's their platform to continue to fight this fight, to continue to bring upon change while they're at home and not being on campus?
Well, let me just say, movements have happened on campus, but they've also started off campus, in the streets, in neighborhoods, in favelas, in shanty towns,
right.
in these marginalized communities. But also, what's important is for folks to remember that young people have always, and when I say always, I mean always, been at the forefront of major movements in the United States and across this country.
Right.
From the early days of the suffragette women's rights movement to the civil rights movement. A lot of people forget that Dr. King and Malcolm X and so many other leaders like John Lewis, who was only 23 at the time when he gave his address at the March on Washington for jobs and freedom. Dr. King was in his 30s. Malcolm X was also in his 30s. These were men that were assassinated in their 30s. Wow. We talk about the LGBTQ plus movement, young people. When we talk about the Black Lives Matter movement, young people, young Black queer women in particular. But young people have been at the forefront of several national and international movements. And I say that intentionally because I want young people, and I'm not talking as if I'm some kind of a boomer, right? But as a millennial and as someone who is looking at my generation and the generation coming after us, Generation Z, I want folks to understand that there is a place for you in movements. And sometimes what that place looks like is young people creating, organizing amongst themselves and creating the organizations that will bring about the change that they're seeking. Young people have always been involved and will continue to be involved. And I'm always encouraged when I see, young people across this country and across the world, whether it's walking out on the issue of climate change, whether it's on the issue of gun violence, whether it's on the issue of women and girls, whether it's the issue of Muslim youth, right? Young people are showing up and showing out, and I think they should be supported. I think they should be listened to, and I think every movement must understand, I don't care what movement or what change you're seeking, right, for good, every single movement for good must include the voices and the input of young people. It only makes our movement stronger, right? And that's the kind of intergenerational organizing that also needs to take place. So I'm optimistic about our future, but I'm also an impatient optimist as a millennial. Our generation, right? We have been pushing because we're a generation that has experienced the worst of an economic crisis and a housing crisis and a jobs crisis.
You add on a whole global pandemic on top of that.
Right, but not just a global pandemic, but my generation, millennials, have experienced quite a few wars and have seen quite a few wars that the United States has been engaged in both at home and abroad. And we are also the most indebted generation.
Right.
College debt is now higher than credit card debt in the United States.
Which needs to be canceled, good enough for all.
Right. We have inherited some of the most challenging global crises that requires action over the next 10 years, particularly around our climate and emissions. We have obviously experienced, a global pandemic, but also so many movements for change, as well as so many political figures that have been in power and that have caused so much damage, right? And so for millennials, all we've known is struggle, right? And that's not to say other generations have not, but we have been pushing and we've been agitating and we've been doing that, and it's just, and we were continuing to do that, right? But it is really encouraging to see, as an organizer, as an activist, and as a legislator, it's really encouraging to see young people taking up their rightful places in movements, speaking up, organizing, walking out, holding not just adults, but people in power accountable, making demands, and are so forward thinking and so inclusive in the way that they're doing that. And I think, simply put, the kids are right. The kids are doing just fine. And I think that bodes well for our future, and we should be pouring into them and investing in them and ensuring that they are being heard and they have the platforms in order to share their experiences.
That's very well said. I want to say thank you so much, Delegate Acevero.
Let me ask you this, though, real quick, to you and Yasmin. Right? As young people who obviously are engaged, where do you feel we're going? Right? And I guess I'm curious to find out, how do you all feel about the road we're going down? How do you feel about the movements, the change? How do you feel about your generation, and how do you feel about Yusuf, I think, and Yasmin, correct me if I'm wrong, but you may be a millennial. Yasmin, I believe, not sure, but I'd love to get your perspective. Like, yes, certainly. I mean, this is my view of where we are and where we're headed. But I think equally as important is, what are your thoughts? What are you hearing from young people about what's taking place in the streets and our future?
Yes, me?
You said you want to start, or me?
Go ahead.
Okay, so what I think is that our generation is honestly might be one of the strongest generations we've had. I think we have a very vast potential to band together and bring about change that we believe in. I also think that a lot of topics nowadays are being brought up that are very important, and I'm glad they're being brought up now, because in the past they should have been brought up, but they haven't been. But I think that due to our generation, and not just our generation, but mostly because of how many people talk about the things that are going on nowadays, it's like the most important issues are being brought to light. And I'm glad that young people are fighting for the right to speak, for the right to make change, and for the right to have their opinions in place, and make sure that they're setting changes in place that will guarantee that minorities have, they have the right to, or not the right, they have a support system, basically, in which they can talk to each other and bring about change in the way that their life is going on, or the way that life handles, the way they handle life, I guess.
That's very
but yeah, that's about it.
That's very well said. I feel like, to me personally, the way we're headed, Delegate Acevero, is, I feel like we always emerge, as you always said, amongst the hardest of times, and I feel like true leadership is shown or is highlighted during the hardest of times. And we've seen so many people who are in places of power fail to bring upon these changes and be leaders during hard times, especially during these times and during this global pandemic. I see my generation as a generation that has the willpower to change what they see wrong, the confidence to speak up when they think something is wrong. They have the kind of maturity to sit down with their local leaders. I think in mosques where I go and pray, or in parks that I go and spend time with my friends, I feel like I spend time with my friends and we talk about things that matter in our community, in our country, and back in our home countries and as immigrants as well. So our generation definitely has that kick to it. We see that we're not in a special, we don't have any special circumstances. And in this generation, it's a lot of different races, it's a lot of different people, a lot of different beliefs and backgrounds. But I feel like we can be the most accepting generation. We can be the most loving generation. We can accept everybody. We can hear each other out, as long as we have that end goal to be free together, to spend time together, to analyze the wrongs in our communities, to correct everything that's wrong, everything that we inherited from past generations, that we will be good for to change. So this generation we're crucial for our next generation, because if we mistreat what the opportunity that we're giving today, we're giving an opportunity to bring about real change, to talk about real issues. I feel like none of the issues that we spoke upon today in this podcast can be overlooked by any circumstances. Every single topic that we discussed today is a crucial topic that needs to be changed, that needs to be spoken about. So this generation really needs to just band together and hear each other out. And in doing so, we can speak to our lawmakers. As Delegate Acevero here, not a day in my life could you tell me that a person who's holding a public office can sit down with me and just have a simple conversation with me. I would never believe it. So to have a person, a true public servant like Delegate Acevero to sit down with me today and talk to me gives me the most confidence that our generation is at least at the right path to bring upon that true and real change. So our generation, we need to elect people who have the correct mindset as us, people who have the at least the same experiences, or who understand the same experiences as us. So we don't need to be electing people who have these different, totally chaotic views, but we need to elect people who will think like us, and because when we elect people that know us and know what we need to be changed, then that's how we begin about real change. So our generation needs to engage in conversation. We need to engage in dialogue. We need to talk about everything that we see is wrong. If it's not fixed, at least it's discussed and addressed, and that way it can be fixed later on. That's how I see it, Delegate Acevero.
I appreciate it, brother, and know that I'll always stand in solidarity with each and every one of you all. I support your leadership, and I think the future is one that I'm a little more optimistic about, and I have more hope about,
right,
based on, not just our successes, but the people who are ready to take up the fights that we're in right now, and the fights that we'll be engaged in the future, right? So that we all can get free. really happy to be in conversation with you and Yasmin. I appreciate both of your leadership, and continue to be engaged, continue to disrupt, continue to insist on your voice being heard. I mean, this is the kind of engagement that we need, and this is the kind of a leadership that we need from young people today. So I appreciate it. It was really great to be in conversation with you both, and let's continue to stand in solidarity and to fight for each other.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Delegate. We appreciate you fighting the good fight for us, and wish you the best of luck in all your endeavors.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you, Yasmin. Great convo. Can't wait to listen to all the future episodes. Keep at it, and solidarity.
Yes, sir. This was the Caretake episode 1 with Delegate Acevero. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you guys soon.